Good morning, everybody, and thank you for once again joining me for one of my remote media avails from here in Washington, D.C. Um, well, it's finally going to happen. The Senate today is going to pass the so-called CHIPS Plus legislation, a bill that's had more names than probably any piece of legislation I've ever worked on. And this bill, which after we pass it today in the Senate in a broad bipartisan way, will go to the House. I believe it'll be passed before Friday. So a legislation I've been working on and one of the original authors of for more than 2 years, I think will be signed by the president by the weekend or early next week. Let me very briefly go through. Many of you have heard me talk about this, particularly over the last year, but first raising the issue even longer ago than that. Let me talk about the three components of the bill: the CHIPS portion, the 5G portion, and then the science title, and why it's important. And while not something that's attracted as much attention as I was like, I actually think from a historic standpoint and in terms of technology competition, not only in semiconductors or 5G, but across the series of domains, maybe look back as one of the most significant pieces of legislation that the Congress has gotten to the president in years, if not decades. The first portion of the bill, which has attracted a lot of attention, is $52 billion in immediate spending to make sure that we control our destiny in terms of semiconductors. Chips are involved in anything that has, semiconductor chips are involved in anything that has an on and off switch, from cars to fighter jets, to cell phones, to televisions, to the sensors that may be, creating autonomous vehicles currently or in the future. And unfortunately, in this field, we've seen American leadership. While we invented this industry in the 70s and 80s, we've seen this where America created about and produced about 37% of the chips in the mid-90s to today, where we're down to about 12%. Over the last number of years, I think we've built about 15 new semiconductor fabs or manufacturing plants here in America, whereas there's been about 120 built around the world. While we've seen our share of chip production go dramatically down, cut by 2/3, we've seen East Asia in particular rise to where the production facilities, the majority of chips in the world are coming out of East Asia. And two areas in particular that are extraordinarily important. One, China, the People's Republic of China, $100 billion into chip manufacturing facilities in China. And then, which is the current dominating country in the whole world in chips, is Taiwan. As a matter of fact, many of the most leading edge chips in the world, chips that are used in our most advanced military equipment, aren't produced in America. They come out of Taiwan. And as we've seen President Xi and China become more and more aggressive about his comments about taking Taiwan back over, if Xi were to move militarily on Taiwan or even on an economic blockade and cut off the supply of those semiconductor chips to the rest of the world or to the United States, particularly the cutting edge ones, we would not have a recession, we would have a depression. So over a year ago, John Cornyn and I, Republican senator from Texas, said we need to make sure that we maintain the R&D capabilities around semiconductor chips. We need to make sure that we can build at least a dozen more semiconductor manufacturing factories here in America. And we need to make sure that we have a control over the supply chain. And that's important in terms of national security, as I think I've laid out. It's important in terms of American jobs. Each one of these chip manufacturing facilities will create thousands of jobs. We have one of those facilities in Northern Virginia, in Micron and Manassas, literally thousands of jobs, gone through a number of expansions. These facilities always need to be upgraded because we have, frankly, one that was built in the 90s outside of Richmond in Henrico that the company didn't stay current, and unfortunately that is now shuttered. Literally, this is a jobs program as well as national security, and ultimately it will deal with inflation. As I've explained in previous calls, there are literally tens of thousands of cars sitting in factory lots in Ohio and Michigan that can't get into the marketplace, not because they don't have steel or tires or other equipment, but because they don't have semiconductor chips, because of there are shortages. Autos obviously have been one of the fastest rising cost points in our inflationary economy. While signing this legislation won't solve this problem overnight, it will send a signal to the market that America will be back in the game in this most critical component of microelectronics. So the CHIPS portion of the bill, $52 billion, is extremely important. My hope is that with my work on this, we can secure one of those factories in Virginia, and I intend to keep working with the companies involved. I would also indicate, just very briefly, we passed this bill originally in the Senate over a year ago, and the fact that we did that but didn't get it to the president's desk, we've actually seen even our European allies jump ahead of us in terms of some of the subsidies to some of these countries, where Germany and France have actually secured chip manufacturing plants in their countries because our political process took over a year to get this to the president's desk. Again, that's looking backwards, but we'll be back in the game once this bill gets signed. The second component, which I've also talked to you all about a number of times, which is the question around 5G. Some of you may recall my concerns raised about the Chinese telecom company Huawei, a national security risk. We are actually literally ripping out Huawei equipment in America where it was installed because of that security risk. Other countries in Europe are ripping out Huawei equipment. The challenge was Huawei, this is wireless communications, kind of leapt ahead of other Western competitors. There'll be $1.5 billion in this legislation as well to make sure that we promote next generation beyond 5G. It's called more software-based systems called O-RAN, and that will allow us and our allies to get back in the game and actually present a better model than the Huawei equipment that's in this space. The third part of this legislation is really called the science title. And while these are not appropriated dollars, these are simply authorizations, there is a dramatic plus up on Department of Energy national lab funding, which I think will be a good benefit to Jeff Labs down in Newport News. There will be significant funding in terms of NSF, National Science Foundation, which is located in Northern Virginia. It's mostly a way to distribute funds, but to make sure that we increase our research capabilities. And in the science portion, there's a series of other programs. One is a program that says there'll be an effort to create 10 regional technology hubs. And a number of these hubs have to be created outside of traditional urban areas. And I am working already with a series of regions around Virginia to see if we can secure one of those tech hubs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So a long time coming, and the sausage making on this has not been a pretty story. But we will pass the legislation today, get it over to the House, and it'll get to the president. And it's terribly important. So with that, I'll skip over all of the other things that we're real time working on. I wanted to lay out why I think this legislation is important in terms of jobs, national security, maintaining America's innovation, and quite honestly, why it's important for Virginia as well. With that, Laura, I'll turn it over to you, and happy to take the questions.
Senator, our first question will be from Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Thanks. Hi, Senator.
Hey.
Wanted to ask you about student loans. It's being reported that the president is kind of weighing right now whether or not to extend the pause. Obviously, people have gotten used to not paying their loans for a while. Do you think this is the time, where he can stop that pause, have people restarting, and what can be done to help borrowers who are really struggling to make payments?
Well, Hannah, I think it's been very appropriate that there's been a pause on people who owe student loans during COVID. And I think, if the president wanted to extend that pause a bit longer for 2 or 3 more months, particularly with so many Virginians struggling with inflation, I'm okay with that. I do have some concerns about a complete willingness to write off all of that student debt. There are many cases where people have been taken advantage of, but there are many cases where people are in professional careers and they will recoup those dollars. And I do feel a little bit of unfairness for people who paid back their student debt, or people that didn't go to college, that it is a bit of a complete wiping off of that student debt would probably be a bit too far and might create a backlash. I am in favor of targeted debt relief for say the first $10,000 or a bit more. Where I really think we ought to be focusing is how can we bring down the interest rate costs on that student debt? If we can, I was advocating this particularly before interest rates went up, but if we could bring down all student debt to an interest rate of say 2 or 3%, that would provide targeted relief without letting people completely, off the hook. In many ways, there's too many students I'm aware of, or their families that are still looking at 7 and 8% student debt numbers. Cutting that down to 2 to 3%, there would be relief, but it would still make sure that those dollars got repaid. That's where I hope the president would go. But in the interim, I do hope he extends the moratorium on repayment because of the economic challenges around inflation, at least for another 3 months.
Senator, our next question will be Jackie DeFusco with WIRC.
Hey, thanks for taking my question. The Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates again today as some economists fear a recession is near. It seems the Biden administration has been playing those fears of a recession. So I just wonder what your thoughts are, and how do you respond to those pointing the finger at Democrats for this?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I was, a month or two ago, was traveling with some of my Republican friends, and we were helping build the case for Finland and Sweden's movement into NATO. We'd been in Finland, we'd been in Turkey, and gas in Finland is about $10 a gallon. And I kind of said, this is all due to Joe Biden as well. And some of my Republican friends kind of laughed at that. I mean, clearly we've got high inflation. And I think the Fed, and I think the administration, and I think, frankly, most business leaders got this wrong a year plus ago when we thought it was simply transitory. But the causation of this inflation, and a whole series of factors, but two of the biggest is the war in Ukraine, where that has cut off supplies of Russian oil and gas to the world markets. And we do need to find alternatives because we need to make sure that Putin is not successful in that war. And secondarily, the kind of complete lockdown approach that China took with COVID. When you shut down a country that is as large as China, that screws up the supply chains and drives up costs. And one of the reasons why I think whether it's semiconductor chips or some other legislation I'll be introducing, we need to make sure that we are not dependent on the future as much on Chinese supply chain. In terms of the actions of the Fed, I do think the most powerful tool that can be used against inflation, and this is whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, is slowly raising interest rates. And I think the Fed waited too long. And this is as much an art as it is a science. So I think it's probably appropriate that the Fed raise interest rates today to kind of put a little bit of a brakes on the economy, to make money more expensive. Will we fall into a recession? I think that we are trying to navigate it so far, at least. Even if this quarter shows some slowing of economic growth, I mean, I'm a pretty old guy at this point. I've lived through a lot of recessions. I've never seen a recession where there's as strong a job market as there is right now. So the technical definition I'll leave to the economists. As long as we see 250, 350, 400,000 a month job growth, and that's strong a job market, I don't think we're going to be in a full classic recession, even if the definitions of a recession are met. So I think we all, I wish some of my colleagues would be more about, promoting growth policies rather than simply criticizing the administration, because I didn't hear a lot of them, a year and a half ago saying we ought to raise interest rates. And again, I go back to President Trump, who literally beat up the Fed on regular basis to try to push interest rates down to get easy money into the economy. And I don't hear them criticizing his economic policies. And the challenge around a recession is, in economics, some of it is science. I said some of it is art in terms of how the Fed raises rates, but some of it is so much of it is psychological. And if you have people banging the drum, recession, 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 it becomes in many ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. And maybe that's good for short-term politics for some in this country, but it's not good for the economic well-being of Virginians and Americans.
Our next question will be Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks a lot for joining us. And I'm old enough to remember when it was called the Endless Frontier Act. At any rate, I know a lot of work went into this legislation that will pass today, but I also wanted to ask a question about what's left of Build Back Better. Do you think the Senate can get to a vote next week on lowering prescription drug prices, and how important do you think that is so that Democrats would get another legislative win in addition to CHIPS before the August recess?
Well, let me fully acknowledge on chips, semiconductors, the 5G, the science title, that is truly bipartisan. No, the president will get some benefit from it, but it has been bipartisan, and I want to commend my Republican partners on that. On the whatever we're calling, you talk about changing names, whatever Build Back Better or reconciliation is called this week. I do kind of laugh at times. I do think the Democratic plan initially was way too aspirational. We should have realized in a 50-50 Senate you weren't going to change virtually every social policy and every economic ill in America. I think having Medicare negotiate for drug prices is a huge deal. People have been talking about this, again, not just Democrats, but Republicans as like, for 20 plus years. And this is an area where I've changed my view. I used to have a lot more sympathy for the American pharmaceutical industry because, but I, frankly, whether it's insulin costs, where I've got a daughter with type 1 insulin or type 1 diabetes, and we've seen her insulin costs go up, 300%, 400% in the 20 years she's had diabetes. That's not fair. It's not right. I'm lucky enough to be able to afford to pay for that. Many families are not. And if you're a type 1 diabetic, you don't get insulin, you die. So it's not a nice to have, it is a life-saving drug. And we've seen too many places where those drug costs have gone up dramatically more than even inflation. And in many ways, what happens is the drug industry makes so much profits out of America, they then use those profits, yes, to fund the research and development, but the rest of the world doesn't contribute their fair share. So let's go ahead and negotiate drug prices, bring costs down. You talk about something that will help people with inflation. Drug costs have gone up as virtually as much as anything on an inflationary basis. Bring those costs down, provide relief to Virginia and American families right away. Only, the Democrats at this point could do that and somehow be viewed as that being not a big thing. I think it's a very big thing. I'm hopeful it's going to be an ugly process, just the way reconciliation is done. But I do think and hope and believe that we will get that legislation to the president's desk, at least out of the Senate before the end of next week.
Our next question will be Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Good morning, Senator. I'm interested in the CHIPS Act, or whatever you're calling CHIPS. As you know, I'm interested in what's going to happen in the House. The Speaker, kind of held it up for a long time. Build Back Better last year. Then they loaded it up with the stuff to make you go through conference. And then I gather Mr. McConnell at one point was going to block it because of the reconciliation process on the other bill you just spoke about. So the question is, what is it a smooth way to passage now, or what's going to happen in the House? And what I gather that McConnell has also, he voted to end cloture yesterday.
Great question, Michael. I mean, and again, you talk about frustrating. We passed this a year ago. If the House had taken it up last year and passed it, we would have seen at least $50 billion of additional investment in the United States, just in the last year in terms of commitments. The fact that we waited an additional year, the fact that many of these chip manufacturing companies, American and otherwise, have chosen to build in other countries rather than America because we didn't, put the same kind of program in place in the United States that virtually every one of our other competitive countries have put in place. We wouldn't get another chip manufacturing facility in America if we don't do this. I think it was a lost opportunity. That being said, Leader McConnell voted for the legislation yesterday. I'm sure hope he will vote for the passage today. And I've gotten from the top level Democratic leadership in the House, they will take the bill up as passed and pass it immediately. They are actually trying to get out of town even at the end of this week. So if we get it done today, I anticipate that they would get it done before the end of the week. And there's an awful lot of Republican House members who desperately want this to happen. So I hate to say, Michael, we've both been around this stuff for a long time. Nothing's done until it's done. But even I would be shocked if we saw a screw up in the process this late date. If we did, shame on us, because from a national security, from a jobs, from an inflation standpoint, this is a critical piece of legislation.
Senator, our next question will be Kelsey Childress with WSET.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for doing this. In terms of inflation and the possible recession that pretty much everyone's talking about, what do you think should be done, and is the Senate doing anything to help fight off this possible recession?
Well, if the Senate passes the ability to have Medicare negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, that will provide immediate economic relief as it's phased in to families in terms of drug costs. So that will give them a little more space. One of the things that I wish we would have done was actually providing more assistance for childcare and universal pre-K, because if we could have provided that assistance and gotten more women back into the workplace, we all know lots of families post-COVID, if you can't find a place for your kid, then you're not going to be able to go back to work. Putting more people into the workforce would actually drive down inflationary pressures. I think we should have worked on that. I do regret the fact that Senator Manchin is my friend, but has moved away from some rolling back some of the Trump tax cuts. Frankly, raising taxes on the top 1% of Americans, or having them pay a little more fair share, actually is anti-inflationary, because if you take that kind of extra capital out of some of the wealthiest of Americans, that helps drive down prices as well. I hope one of the things that we could do, number 4, going forward, and this is going to take a little bit of time, but we need to learn after COVID, we can't be as reliant on supply chains, particularly coming out of a China where, in many areas we are fierce competitors. 80% plus of the basic compounds that go into our pharmaceuticals come from China. We've seen a move towards electric vehicles. China creates most of the electric batteries in the world, because they get the rare earth minerals, cobalt and otherwise, and do the processing in China. We've got to free ourselves from that kind of supply chain, and I'm going to have some legislation on this going forward. So there are more things that the Senate should and can do in the coming months. But in terms of immediate effect, and again, this is Econ 101, the most immediate effect will be the actions of the Fed to slightly raise interest rates. I mean, the truth is, not only were the interest rates kept artificially low, which obviously helped the stock market a lot, but the Fed ingested through quantitative easing and a series of other tools, literally trillions of dollars into the economy that didn't get a lot of review. Ratcheting that back and slightly raising interest rates, we're still going to see them way below historic norms. But you got to do it, as I said, it's art as much of a science, because if the psychology of the economy turns too much and people all say, oh gosh, money's going to get tighter, I'm not going to stop spending, then you could, overnight, you could get into a recession. So far, the data indicates, both in terms of job growth, and historically you see negative job growth during a recession. We're still seeing a very strong job market, and while people are feeling the effects of recession, the majority, at least, of kind of middle class and upper middle class families are still spending at a, frankly, almost historic levels. So, this is again, art and science, but there are a series of actions. The CHIPS bill, health care, child care, negotiating on drug prices, dealing with supply chain. Those are all things that will deal with inflation, but none of them are going to happen overnight.
Senator, this will be our last question from Danielle Sandler with WVNS. Danielle? Okay, we're going to move on. Oh, perfect. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was unmuting myself. Sorry about that. Good morning, Senator. My name is Danielle Sandler, and I have a question about the CHIPS legislation. You spoke a little bit about this earlier in your introduction, and I was curious as to, if it's passed, what will these chips be used for, and more specifically, which companies will benefit from this legislation, and also it connects to the chip shortage. How do we prevent that from happening again?
Well, great question. And the chip manufacturing companies are American companies like Intel, Micron, which already has a fab in Virginia. It's frankly some of these Taiwanese companies I mentioned, like TSMC, that's frankly probably the most advanced chip company in the world. We need to bring some of that capacity here in America. It's companies like the Korean company Samsung. It is Global Foundries out of New York. There's about 12 to 15 companies that would have some of the direct beneficiary, but beyond that, there are all the equipment companies that make the very sophisticated equipment that goes on the manufacturing factories' floors. There's another 20 plus companies there. Again, as I've said, I'd like to see some of those companies locate their facilities in Virginia, and I'm in active conversations on that subject. What it will do in terms of on the auto industry, for example, the chips that go into those automobiles are called legacy chips. They're not the most cutting edge, but frankly, we got a shortage of them. And if we send this market signal that there's going to be more capacity, you're going to see more production there, and we'll get those cars that are already built off the factory parking lots and into the economy, and that will again help drive down car prices. So this piece of legislation, from chips to next generation wireless to the scientific investments, I know it's not created as much buzz as some of the other bills, but I think from a historic standpoint, we will look back at this law and say this is when the United States stepped back into the game in terms of innovation, in terms of supply chain, and in terms of recognizing that we have a strategic technological competition, particularly with China. And when I say China, my beef is with the Communist Party and Xi Jinping. It is not with the Chinese people, or obviously not with the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, but it is with the Communist Party of China, who has been very clear in their documents. What they hope to do is dominate the world market, beat America, not only in chips, but in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology, where all of the advances of the 21st century are coming. It is, again, incumbent upon us, from a national security standpoint, from a job standpoint, and from just plain values, because these technologies, do you really want an artificial intelligence system that's controlled by the Communist Party? That ought to scare the dickens out of all of you. We've got to set the rules, guidelines, and with our allies around the world on these emerging technologies. And I think this piece of legislation will be looked at as historic in those areas. Thank you, everybody, and appreciate hanging in. And sorry again for the long answer. I know this is a bill that we've talked about a lot. It's a little bit complicated, but I do think, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll look back and say, this is when America re-upped its investment. I think this may be as important as the Sputnik moment was, back in the late 50s, where we had kind of gone to sleep at the switch until then Soviet Union put a satellite up before America, and we responded under President Kennedy's leadership in unprecedented ways. I think this is the first step of America regaining its leadership in technology and innovation.